Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso, and I'm here with Ayavadda. And today we'll be talking about a topic that was requested by one of our viewers who asked us to speak about how to talk about renunciation with one's family. So in particular, for a person who is interested in monastic life and who is an only child. So this was the request that was made, someone asking how could an only child who's interested in monastic renunciation explain this to their family. But we can also talk in more general terms about how to speak about renunciation and monasticism when relating to family. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then we'll each say a few words on the topic. And if there's any questions, you're welcome to put in questions at any time, and we'll take them at the end. So we'll go ahead and pay homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So someone sent in a request that we speak about the question of how to speak about renunciation to one's family, particularly as someone who is interested in monastic life. And the specific of the question was someone who's an only child, how to speak about this with their parents. But I think as a starting point to a longer discussion, this is a good place to get started. And so maybe I'll start with a few opening remarks, and then we'll see if Ayavadda has something he'd like to say on the topic, and then we'll see where it goes from there. So the first thing that I would like to say is to keep in mind that ultimately, each one of us has a responsibility to decide for ourselves what we're going to do with our lives. And for those who have a strong inclination towards Dhamma practice, a strong aspiration to follow the Buddha's instructions, then it's normal to think about monastic life. And if one finds that one has a strong tendency towards monastic life, then it is important to pursue that regardless of what your family thinks. So the history of Buddhism is full of wonderful monks, bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, who became monastics against the wishes of their family members. So despite their parents and other relatives not wanting them to become monastics, they did so anyway, and turned out wonderful. So including the Buddha himself. The story that we have is that the Buddha's family wanted him to remain as a layperson. But the Buddha to-be had something else in mind. He wanted to delve deeply into spiritual practice and discover for himself the truth of reality. Discover for himself the way out of out of suffering towards awakening. So this ultimately is our own personal responsibility, is to decide for ourselves what we're going to do, decide for ourselves how to live most closely in accordance with our highest values. The other thing I would like to emphasize also is that from the Buddhist perspective, becoming a monastic and cultivating a deep and profound Dhamma practice is something which brings tremendous benefit not only to yourself, but also to everyone close to you, including your family members. So it brings a lot of blessings into the life of your parents for their child to become a monastic, or if you're a sibling, to have your sibling become a monastic, or even if you're a child and your parent decides to become a monastic. Again, this is something which brings blessings into your life. When a close relative becomes a monastic, it's something which then connects the rest of the family more deeply with the Dhamma. And again, even if the other family members are not initially supportive of the idea, then still it gives them a deeper connection with the Dhamma. And usually over time, they become increasingly supportive. If they recognize that this is something which is bringing happiness and wisdom to the relative who's become a monastic, then usually the other family members will appreciate that. So this is something which touches on another important aspect of this, which is that generally speaking, your family members want you to be happy. However, they usually have their own ideas about how to go about achieving happiness, and their ideas may not match up with yours. So, for example, if your parents are opposed to you becoming a monk, it's probably because they think there's something else in life that will make you happy. But they might be completely wrong about that. So it might actually be that becoming a monk actually is the best way for you to achieve happiness. So your parents want you to be happy, and they think that they know how best for you to be happy. But it may be that actually monastic life is the best option for you. So then after one has been practicing as a monastic for a while, then usually your relatives will notice, oh, this person is happier, they're calmer, they're nicer. Maybe this is a good thing after all. So often the best thing is actually not to try to convince them at all, but just to go ahead and pursue your spiritual aspiration and let the blessings of the Dhamma shine through you in the form of kindness, gentleness, happiness, contentment. And your relatives will usually see that and appreciate that. And they'll tend to change their minds on their own through observing the positive change in you. So those are a few opening remarks I'd like to make on the topic. Maybe Venerable Bhante would like to say a few words.
Thank you, Bhante. Yeah, I'd just like to really appreciate what Bhante said before, and especially the part about the Buddha becoming a monastic while his mother and father were weeping, he said, which was on my mind as well. And I think that that's not ideal. Ideally our parents would be happy and delighted and very supportive. And I would also like to say, if my parents are watching this, that I'm very grateful that they are supportive of my monastic life. So sometimes they are supportive. In my case, I have relatively supportive parents. In other cases, maybe they're supportive, but it's a little bit difficult for them to let go of their child, maybe living out the life that they would like. So it's not always maybe that the parents don't want the person to become a monastic, but that it's just difficult for them to lose someone, in a sense, because a lot of our relationship to people is maybe what we see in them, what we like in them, how we relate to them, and not so much just their own life in and of itself. And so I think it can be difficult for people to lose an aspect of maybe a friend, or even spending time with someone in a certain way, which becomes less possible when someone becomes a monastic often. So I thought maybe what comes to mind is just having compassion and understanding that even if your family members do support you, or if they don't support the aspiration 100% or at all, that probably it's because it is difficult for them, like Bhante was saying. That was really coming to mind for me, of understanding that it will take time for them to see you grow in the Dhamma, and just them seeing that can encourage them, because then they can start to learn, oh, this is how I relate to this person now. So at first there may be a period, I believe, of adjusting, just how do I relate to this person, and how do I let go of what I thought they would want and how I would want to see them. And then learning, oh, I can appreciate these beautiful qualities, and I can see it's helping them, as Bhante was saying. And that time, that period of time of just adjusting to the change in life, because change is something that we all struggle to understand as we grow in the Dhamma, and it's really only through the Dhamma that we can start to accept change. So I think that that's something that we can't expect other people to be 100% okay with. But we can definitely help them, and we can help them by having that compassion. One other thing that was coming to mind is maybe people who don't want to be monastics yet, or they're not becoming monastics yet, because I think Bante did a really, really beautiful coverage of that. But maybe people who are inclining towards renunciation. So I know several lay people who maybe follow the 8 precepts, either full time or often, or partially, or even lay people who are celibate. So they decide because of their Dhamma practice, they want to be celibate, they want to be single, they don't want to have children, or they want to have children, but now that they have children already, they want to start practicing more renunciation. And that's also something that we see even in the time of the Buddha. There were people who were married and they had children, and then as disciples of the Buddha, they decided, okay, now we want to practice more renunciation. And so you have a whole range, I think, of renunciation even before monasticism, where someone could be preparing for monastic life and they decide, okay, I'm going to follow the 8 precepts. Or they could not be a monastic, but decide to follow the 8 precepts. They could be in a family, not in a family. So that whole kind of range of experiences. And I think that that's also difficult because I also remember practicing renunciation. And sometimes it's hard for people to understand, like, why don't you want to get married? Or why don't you want to have children? Or why don't you want to eat all the time? Or a snack, or go see entertainment. That's a big one today. Also drinking alcohol. Why don't you want to drink alcohol? Why don't you want to go to these parties? Why don't you want to have certain conversations around these topics? All of that is experience of renunciation that I think can be hard to understand. And what was coming to mind for me was really dovetailing off of what Bante mentioned with monastic life, but applying it in lay life. So people seeing, for example, let's say you decide, okay, I'm not going to listen to music, or I'm not going to watch movies, and I'm not going to be in a relationship. And your parents say you're crazy. Well, why would you do that? Or it's almost it can be just as disappointing as someone becoming a monastic, because you may not be wearing monastic clothing and living in a monastery, but you still are relinquishing some of the exact same things that you would be. So I think that rather than trying to convince people this is what this is better, or even worse, trying to convert people, like telling them that their practices of non-renunciation are wrong or worse, rather than doing that, I think it's really best to try to turn the renunciation, the positive side of it, which is giving, its generosity. So the positive side of letting something go is that we give something away. And I think converting that aspect of it is the best way to approach it, I would say. So when we renounce something, let's say you renounce entertainment and spending time in certain ways, then maybe you could then spend that time and you could give it to your family members by spending time with them in more intimate setting. Let's say, oh, do you want to go take a walk together? Do you want to have a conversation together? Or you can give more attention and more time just when you are with them. And because you won't be distracted doing something else, you could say, oh, let's really have this kind of conversation. And then you can also give your precepts. So if you're perfecting the 8 precepts, you'll also be perfecting, non-killing, but also not lying, and ideally not speaking harshly, not speaking in divisive ways, or gossip and hurtful gossip or useless gossip. And so giving people the gift of pure speech, of telling the truth, of not stealing, of gentleness, not harming them, nonviolence, giving them attention and care and time, and then also bringing that inner sense of joy and happiness and contentment that you practice when you are developing these values within yourself. I think that that's the best way to teach them, because it just shows them, oh, this practice is not removing all these things from their life that I wish they had and that they would be better off with, but you rather transform that into really kind of channeling it into generosity for those people. So they see you happier and you make them happier. And I think that that is the best way. It can be difficult, but it can also be, in my limited experience, it can be a little bit easier to embody these values when you are renouncing. So that's something that comes to mind if it's of any help.
Okay, thank you. I'll just make a couple more comments and then we'll see if there's any questions. Another comment I would like to make on the topic of family is sometimes it's also helpful just to ask. Again, if one is interested in monastic life, you can ask them, what is it that concerns them or frightens them about you becoming a monastic? What are they afraid of? And then you can address what their concerns are. So often people they don't understand what monastic life is, and they think they think something is going to happen other than what really will happen. For example, they might think that they'll never see their child again, or that they'll get to see them only very rarely. But that's actually not necessarily the case. Most monasteries, the monks' parents are welcome to come whenever they want. In fact, in many monasteries, it's quite common that there'll be monks' relatives visiting frequently, coming and staying at the monastery for a few days and joining in the life of the community, or staying in the vicinity of the monastery and coming every day to spend time with their relative. It's actually quite common. So it is true that it's not so easy for monks to go to visit family. That's not so easy. But it's usually very easy for family members to come to the monastery and spend time at the monastery with their monk relative. In fact, it's encouraged because that's something which tends to really help the family members to understand monastic life more clearly, and also to clearly see the benefit of it in their relative's life. Yeah, I mean, it can vary. People can have lots of odd ideas about monastic life. So often it's useful just to ask, like, what is their hesitance? What is their concern? What are they worried about? And then you can directly address whatever their concerns are. But yeah, often it is this fear of being disconnected from their relatives, so you can emphasize that that won't happen. Sometimes it's also about not really understanding what renunciation is or why we do it in the first place. I remember many years ago, I was trying to explain to one of my relatives about monastic life, and I was talking about usual things like we don't have sexual relationships, we don't eat dinner, we don't use intoxicants, we don't use entertainment. And I remember him looking at me with this look of horror, like I was willingly giving up all the good things in life. And he said something like, "Why would you do that to yourself?" As though it was like self-torture, that I was choosing not to participate in what he saw as all the good things about life. So instead of talking about renunciation, often it's better to talk about contentment. So why do we do the practices of renunciation? It's to train the mind in contentment. It's to train the mind to be content all the time. Because you can't have sex 100% of the time. You can't eat pizza 100% of the time. You can't watch movies 100% of the time. You can't do sensual pleasure things 100% of the time. But you can have contentment 100% of the time. It's actually the only reliable form of happiness in the world, contentment. It's the only completely reliable, 100% accessible, permanently available form of happiness, contentment. So that's what we're doing. We're training the mind in contentment. We're training the mind how to be completely happy without needing unreliable things. So that can sometimes help people to understand what renunciation is. It's not about giving up the good things in life, but rather it's training the mind to be happy all the time, no matter what happens. And also, as Venerable Buddha was pointing out, so just because you are choosing a life of renunciation, that doesn't then automatically devalue what your relatives are doing. So it's also good to appreciate the good things your relatives are doing, appreciate their wholesome qualities, praise their wholesome qualities, praise their goodness. And it is important also not to cultivate a sense of arrogance. So we choose the life that we live, and they choose the life that they live. So just as you want them to respect your life choices, it's important that you also respect their life choices, even if they're not what you want for yourself. So I think we can go ahead and take a look at some questions, unless you have anything else. Okay,
good idea.
We'll go ahead and have a look at questions. So first off, hello to all the people checking in online. Hello to Rick, Jarrett, Manal, Julie, Karuna, Ming Ming, Mary, Alyssa, Jayanta, John, Vivek, Miguel, Olga, Ellie, and anyone else who's watching in. And I see a couple questions so far. So there's a question from John, which is a bit off topic. So John, you're welcome to bring that question to Monk Chat tomorrow evening. That's the opportunity to ask questions without a limited topic. Questions of any sort tomorrow evening. And we have one question here from Ellie, which is on topic. Ellie asks, how has monastic renunciation helped you on your journey and further connected you to the Buddha? Well, first off, it's important to remember that the Buddha himself was a monastic renunciant. The Buddha himself was a monk who lived a renunciant life. So just by living in this form, I already feel more connected to the Buddha because I'm living closer to how the Buddha himself lived. And that's no small thing in terms of feeling a connection with the Buddha. And as for helping me on my journey, so as I mentioned earlier, the practice of renunciation is a way of training the mind in contentment. So it's training the mind to recognize desires as disruptions to our happiness and to let go of those desires, to recognize how we constantly sabotage our own happiness by seeking for external sources of pleasure. So the practice of renunciation helps us to identify those external dispersions, those ways that we disperse our happiness through seeking something outside of ourselves, and instead to constantly return to our innate capacity for unconditional joy, unconditional happiness. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would agree with Bante about feeling connected to the Buddha in terms of the monastic form, and how it has helped. To add, I would say there's a phrase in the Pali Canon about how the Buddha says he has his awakening experience, and then he says, "This is going to be really hard for people to understand." And the story goes that eventually he thinks, well, there are people with little dust in their eyes who could understand. And this phrase, little dust in their eyes. And I think there's different ways of relating to that. But one of the ways that I've related to it, just in my experience, is the dust is the sensuality, it's the sensual pleasures, because I found that when I start to create distance between the senses and being gratified with pleasures, it's almost like all this dust that's been collecting for so long is starting to clear, because as Bante was saying, we disperse our happiness, and we can't see that. We just can't see so much. We can't see that, one, the senses are they have a danger as well as a gratification, and also that there is a higher escape through renunciation and letting go and finding that contentment and going deeper inside. And also, we can't see that they're impersonal because we make it so personal by finding so much pleasure in them, that it just makes it so difficult to see what the Buddha is talking about. And I think that's one of the ways that relate to when he said that we have so much, many beings have so much dust in their eyes, and that only beings with little dust in their eyes can really see, because we're so caught up in the world. We have so much dust in terms of all the stimuli that we're caught up in, that we can't really see the profound, like, deep Dhamma about the nature of our experience. We're so caught up in the surface of it. And so I found that monastic renunciation, in terms of letting go of not just individual sense pleasures, but actually making a commitment to taking vows of living a lifestyle of renunciation, just every day it's a reminder of like, oh, this is why I'm here. If I were here to indulge in sensual pleasures, then I'm really not doing justice to my life choice. uh, so yeah, just kind of like as a big reminder of we are here to let go of sensuality. Of course, renunciation it can be bigger, but I think a lot of it is really about sensuality. Ultimately, it's larger, but yeah, the sensual, renouncing sensuality in terms of living just to indulge in pleasure, it makes a big difference. And then the other thing I would add is the generosity of others. That when we renounce, for instance, money, and when we renounce certain levels of independence, um, with the vows of poverty and related vows, that I've just found so much more contact with beautiful people, so much contact with people who are cultivating generosity, cultivating sila, who aspire to the to practicing and really embodying and realizing the beauty of the Dhamma, and just having my life also be dependent on those people. I think it helps take away a sense of, me in the world doing my activities. And really it's about being a good person because other people are supporting my life, and also learning from all those other people and learning from their beautiful actions. So if I hadn't renounced certain things, I wouldn't be in constant contact with beautiful people. And so that's really been helpful for me as well.
Thank you. And Karuna has a question. Karuna says, what do you say to relatives who ask why you can't just be a Siladra? If they're like, why do you need to do it the hard way? I want to be tactful to not put down Siladra practice because we know many. Well, first off, I would just ask yourself, what are you looking for? So if you are looking to practice in a form created by the Buddha, established by the Buddha, passed down for 2,500 years from the time of the Buddha, the form created by a fully awakened being in order to support women in attaining full awakening, then there is only one form, and that's the bhikkhuni form. If you want to follow something created by ordinary human beings a few years ago, well, that's the Siladra form. So it doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad form, but the question is, like the earlier question was about being connected to the Buddha. Why am I a bhikkhu? I'm a bhikkhu because bhikkhu is the form that was created by the Buddha. So if one wants to feel connected to the Buddha, if one wants to follow in the footsteps of the Buddha, if one wants to live a life committed to the Dhamma Vinaya taught by the Buddha, then there is only one option. There is only one form. Or to be more precise, there are two forms. One is the form of the bhikkhu bhikkhuni, and the other is the form of the laywoman or layman. So that's it. Those are the only forms. So the other part of this question of why do you need to do it the hard way? So there's some inherent judgments there. For one thing, I'm not entirely convinced that the Siladra way is therefore the easy way. It carries its own set of unique challenges. I'm also not necessarily sure that we should be judging what path we take by whether it's easy or whether it's hard. Rather, we should be choosing our path by how closely it accords with the Buddha's teachings. And again, if one wants to follow the Buddha's teachings most closely, then as a monastic, there is only the form of bhikkhu and bhikkhuni. There is no other monastic form created by the Buddha. So some people want to follow a different monastic form, and that's fine if that's what they want to do. But if you want to follow the Buddha's teachings, if you want to live the life that the Buddha created for us, then that's the life of the bhikkhuni. But again, it's up to you. It's up to what you want to do. And if your relatives want to be Siladras, then your relatives are welcome to be Siladras. That's certainly their choice. But if you want to be a bhikkhuni, then that's your choice. So if your relatives think it's better to be a Siladra, then they're welcome to become Siladra. That's certainly their prerogative. Also, it's interesting, by the way, that you say that you know many Siladra. I actually don't know any. I know that a few of them exist. I just have never met one. I don't know any at all. I know many bhikkhunis. I know 0 Siladra. So there's extremely few Siladra in the world. There's only a handful of them, and only in one place in the world. It's an order which is almost non-existent in terms of the global Buddhist community. Whereas bhikkhunis, if you count all Buddhist traditions, then there are literally hundreds of thousands of bhikkhunis. Millions, actually, if we want to be realistic about it, when we start including all the monastics throughout the Asian world, including Mahayana monastics, literally millions. That's a lot. So you're not alone. The world is full of bhikkhunis. The world has only a tiny, tiny, tiny handful of Siladra. So again, I wouldn't use that as an argument either. So if you want to feel like part of the vast global Buddhist family, the vast global Buddhist family is composed of bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. Other forms represent only a tiny fraction of the Buddhist world. And Sleep Doc, Jarrett has a question. If one is constrained by student debt and therefore doesn't qualify to join monastic life, is it possible to spend weekends at the monastery in order to deepen practice?
Yes, it's very possible. Just send us, if you go on the website, emptycloud.org, there's a part of the website to visit the monastery, and there's an application where you can fill out for overnight residencies. Usually we recommend people stay at least 3 nights, but we know you, and if you'd like to stay a weekend, I think that would be most likely accepted depending on the dates. So just send us an application form, and you're welcome to stay for longer periods of time as well. Yeah.
Okay, and Julie says, sometimes loved ones are afraid by what they see on the news of corrupt monastics. How to reassure them? Well, you could point out that the news is full of news of corrupt lay people. So therefore, it's better not to be a lay person because there's so much news about corrupt lay people. In reality, corrupt monastics are only a tiny percentage. The vast majority of monastics are pretty decent people. But of course, you get a few not so great ones. That's just a matter of numbers. There's literally millions of Buddhist monks in the world, literally millions. So of course, some of them are going to be not so great, which is sad, but it's inevitable. It's just a matter of numbers. Okay, Rick has a question. How do we interact with family and friends who have strong religious beliefs that Buddhism is Satan worshipping or a cult? They feel they must do spiritual warfare against us becoming a monk. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I'd say that that's an interesting belief, and it's good to have compassion for them, because if they feel that they must do spiritual warfare against you becoming a monk, then I'm sorry, but that's pretty serious, right? It's quite serious. So I would definitely feel compassion, and also that means that they must care about you to some extent. So I wouldn't be too forceful against it. I would more come at it from the perspective of, wow, they are really concerned about me, that they feel they must do spiritual warfare. I would also be curious how they got to that opinion. And I think it would probably be good to, again, not be confrontational and not expect them to change their mind. In my opinion, I think the best way to approach it is you should have a conversation with them expecting that they will never change their mind about this issue. And then if they do change their mind, that's great. Like, it doesn't mean you don't try to, you just accept their beliefs. But if you have the idea in your mind of, I must change it, I must do spiritual warfare by debating these opinions, then it's probably more likely to cause conflict than anything. But I do think you should try to dialogue with them and try to see if they're willing to change their mind, but not expecting to change their mind. And what I would ask, I would try to gently and open-mindedly figure out why they hold that belief. Because I've read some of the Bible, and I don't ever remember coming across a passage that says Buddhism is Satan worshiping. So they are interpreting that somehow. And it's actually kind of an interesting belief, because I've encountered, people who are Christians, usually living in the United States, who maybe think Buddhism is a cult. But Buddhism is one of the oldest, largest religions in the world. It's older than Christianity. So it's about at least about 500 years older than Christianity. So almost half of a millennium older. And I don't know in terms of numbers, but just in terms of Buddhist populations, historically, countries like China, much of Southeast Asia, large parts of South Asia, and stretching into, parts of Europe and kind of around there, a large part of the world has been dominated by Buddhism within the culture. So to say it's a cult, I would just wonder, what exactly do they think Buddhism is? Because it's not something that, you just found on the internet, right? It's actually a huge, very large, ancient religious tradition. And so I think trying to communicate that in some way, it might be good to connect them to monastics in your region. Maybe they don't want to go to the monastery, but maybe just showing them, or talking to them about, how did they get to that view, and trying to understand why they hold that, and just trying to communicate that they don't have to agree with Buddhism, but also there's nothing in Buddhism that contradicts the moral principles of Christianity. So I would say Satan worshiping. Well, in Buddhism, we don't worship
Anything, actually.
Yeah. We don't
Or
have some kind of
anyone.
deity that we're worshiping. We do worship the values of, Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, but Satan is some kind of divine being that, you might look to for guidance or something. We don't do that. So just trying to get, what do they mean by Satan worshiping exactly? And what do they mean by cult? And just trying to understand that, because none of that really has anything to do with Buddhism.
Yeah.
I don't know, Bhante, if you...
Yeah, well, actually, I haven't looked at the statistics recently, but last I checked, Buddhism had over 500 million followers worldwide. The statistics are a bit blurry on this. The numbers vary from, depending on how you count China in particular. But there's at least 500 million Buddhists in the world, and possibly closer to 1 billion. And it is the fourth largest religion in the world. So after Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam, there's Buddhism, fourth largest religion in the world. Yeah, so it's definitely not a cult. It's a global religious phenomenon with a deeply established tradition. So Philos Eternal says, if you have family responsibilities, kids, caring for parents, etc., is it bad karma if one chooses to ordain? Not necessarily. So it depends on your motivation. If you're thinking like, God, I hate my kids, I hate caring for my parents, I want to just abandon all of this horrific, nightmarish responsibilities and run off to the monastery. If that's what you're thinking, yeah, that's bad karma. But instead, if you're thinking, I really have a deep commitment to Buddha Dhamma, and I really want to live a life committed to Buddha Dhamma, and I really feel a strong connection with monastic life, and I want to join the monastic Sangha in order to express my deep commitment to Buddha Dhamma, well, that's a wholesome aspiration. Your next challenge is to arrange for the proper care of your children or your parents. So don't just abandon them, but actually make sure that they're going to be taken care of while you're at the monastery. Because while you're in monastic life, you can't really take care of children. It isn't an option. Taking care of elderly parents can be possible, but it is a little more complicated as a monastic. It can be done, but it's more complicated. So ideally, make arrangements for your relatives to be properly cared for, and then go and begin your monastic life. So, and for example, it's again good to point out the Buddha. The Buddha had a newborn child when he left to become a monastic. But he didn't just like toss the child in the streets and walk away. The child was part of a large extended family where there were lots of people taking care of the children in the family. So he wasn't abandoning his child, but rather he knew that his child was being taken care of. And then after the Buddha attained awakening, he came back and taught his relatives, including his child, the path to awakening. And okay. And Manal says, I realize that practicing renunciation as a layperson leaves me in a state of limbo, in that as much as I'm drawn to practicing this in a much more meaningful way because so there's more to this.
Yeah, probably still.
Yeah.
Maybe Bante, I don't know if in the meantime Rick just said that he lives in a rural part of the USA. The belief is strong in many people who live in this region.
The belief about Buddhism being Satan worshipping or a cult. Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, I would echo what Venerable Buddha said, which is ask them why they think that, why they perceive Buddhism in that way. You can also point out the many similarities between Buddhism and Christianity. So one of the things I found really interesting in monastic life is having interfaith dialogue with Catholic monks and finding out how much we have in common. And it turns out we actually have a lot in common. And actually I found that Catholics in general tend to be quite accepting of Buddhism and of Buddhist monks. And Catholic monastics especially tend to be extremely actually overjoyed to see us and interact with us, and very happy that we're doing what we're doing. And usually they don't have any problems with Buddhism, even though they're practicing a form of Christianity. So I find it interesting that Catholic monastics, who are in theory the most devout Christians in the world, are also the ones who are the most tolerant and in fact appreciative of Buddhism. So Manal continues. He says, drawn to practicing this in a much more meaningful way because certain sense arousals seem so futile. I also deep responsibility towards raising the kids and our livelihood, etc., which occupies 99% of my time. How can I progress through this? Well, first off, I would just say that recognize that at this time, taking care of your children is your Dhamma practice. So it's your opportunity to practice renunciation in the sense of letting go of what you want to do and instead focusing on being the best parent that you can be. So this is your renunciation right now. This is also your practice of metta. So practicing kindness and compassion towards your children. It's your practice of generosity. So giving time and attention and care to your children. That's your practice of generosity. It's definitely a practice of patience and equanimity. Taking care of children requires a lot of equanimity, a lot of patience. So there's lots of wholesome qualities you can develop while raising your children. And you don't need to engage in sensual activities. You can choose not to engage in sensual pleasures as a layperson. At least to a certain extent, of course, while dealing with family life, there's certain activities which you might need to do from time to time, which are not so monastic, but that's part of what you just have to deal with for the time being. And then later on in the future, maybe if you feel drawn towards living a more renunciant life, a more monastic style life, then it might be available. But for now, this is your practice. Taking care of your children is your practice. That is your way of cultivating wholesome qualities. And in the meantime, you can also work on building up your wholesome mind states in other ways. However, as I recall, Mano, you don't have small children. As I recall, your children are all fully grown, unless I'm forgetting something. Does she have a teenager, maybe? No. I thought her children were all fully grown. So I know.
I don't know. I know one. is you
Yeah,
don't
fully
know.
grown.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mano, like responsibilities to children, once they hit 18, you're free. You can do whatever you want. So unless you have some young children that I'm forgetting, I think you're already free. So Dhammadipika says, I am a single child to my single mom, and we are Buddhist, and I have a lot of faith in the Buddha and his teachings. So I told my mom I want to be a monastic, but she doesn't allow me to. Is it good to go against their permission? Well, first off, I would ask your mom why she doesn't want you to be a monastic. So pointing out that to be a monastic is to follow the Buddhist teachings in the closest, deepest, and truest way. Why does she not want you to follow the Buddhist teachings in the deepest and truest way? Ask her that question and see what she says. There's really only one answer. So she would see what she says. And yes, sometimes if you think that your parents are obstructing your monastic life without good reason, then the best option is actually just to go ahead without their permission. Dhammadevika says, my mom wants me to marry. I think you need to explain to your mom what Buddhism is. It sounds like your mom doesn't quite understand Buddhism. The Buddha never, ever, ever said to marry, ever. He never encouraged it. He never recommended it. He did encourage renunciation. He did encourage celibacy. He did encourage monastic life. So I think your mom is missing out on some important details about Buddhism. So I think you need to have a serious conversation with your mother about what Buddha Dhamma is and how it relates to life choices. And BC says, it's interesting that within my family, I've seen a fair amount of renunciation. And while not explicitly towards Buddhism, it's always been towards a more peaceful life. I wonder how many align with the teachings of Buddha but don't know it. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, what I would comment is that kind of in relation to what Mano was saying, I think that it's really important and also just really beautiful when families do have renunciation within them. And I think I would say, I wonder how many align with the teachings of the Buddha. I mean, I couldn't comment on that because you haven't mentioned anything specifically. But in terms of cultivating renunciation towards a more peaceful life, I think that's one of the most valuable gifts that parents or just family members in general, also children, can give to one another. Because, if you are raised in a family where people only find happiness through watching TV and snacking and so forth, or buying products and getting anxious about going to social outings, and then the reality is that you'll never have a concrete example within your family of what that looks like. You'll have to find it elsewhere. And also the other members in your family will have to find it elsewhere. So if you were given the gift, I'd say really it's beautiful that you can appreciate that. And if it's renunciation that doesn't break the precepts and it leads towards peace and contentment and wholesome joy and more renunciation, then I would say it's probably almost 100% in line with the teachings of the Buddha, unless it's renouncing something that's wholesome in favor of something that's unwholesome. Yeah.
Okay. And Dhammadipika further says, when she meets another monastic, she bows to them and encourages other children to follow, but not me. Yeah, once again, I think you need to have a conversation with your mom and ask her, why do you want other people to follow the Buddha, but not me? Why do you not want your own child to follow the Buddha? Ask her that question. So often, once again, one of the problems here is that parents are usually not awakened beings, which means they're usually still struggling with their own delusions and their own attachments and their own desires. And one of the ways they express their desires and delusions is through trying to control their children. So I think that your mother probably on a deep level actually does want you to follow the Buddha, but she just needs a little bit of reminding. She needs to be pointed out that she's actually trying to push you away from the Buddha. And that ultimately, you just want to follow the Buddha. So ask her this question. Why is it that she's okay with other people following the Buddha, but not her own daughter? Why does she want other people to attain awakening, but not her own daughter? Why does she want other people to practice Dhamma, but not her own daughter? These are very important questions. If you have a strong aspiration towards following the Buddha's footsteps, then do so. And don't wait. The older you get, the harder it gets. Don't wait.
Yeah. I was just going to add that if you, I might recommend reading and also maybe sharing with your mother because she's Buddhist. My monastic name, Buddha, there's actually a verse from ancient bhikkhuni who was a disciple of the Buddha named Buddhamata, so the mother of Buddha. And she's instructing her child. So it's actually a story of a mother instructing her child. And she says something along the lines of, please, Buddha, don't ever get entangled in the suffering of the world again. And she is encouraging her son, who is also a disciple of the Buddha, please don't come back. Please don't get reborn again and again. And she said, happy dwell the sages. So she's saying, she loves her son so much that she says, please do not ever suffer so much again by continuing in samsara. And she says that the sages are so happy who renounce the world. And so I think that's actually an example. You could show your mother that there are other mothers historically who were also disciples of the Buddha, and they told their children, because they love them, please stop. Please don't do this again. So, and also they extol the happiness of renunciation. And probably your mother, I can't say, but probably she doesn't want to be alone in old age. So, just trying to offer her support and showing her that she's not the only mother who would want her children to be happy in the teachings of the Buddha.
Yeah. Okay, and that looks like the last question. So if there's nothing else, maybe we can go ahead and conclude at this time. So on the note of monastic renunciation, I'd also like to encourage everyone to check out the upcoming Italian monastery, which we're hoping to open soon in Italy. So I'm posting the link in the comments now, so you're welcome to have a look and see what's coming up soon. And in the meantime, we'll conclude with, Dhammadeepak has a question. How did you convince your parents? I didn't. I became a monk against their wishes. My parents did not want me to become a monk, and I did it anyway. They became convinced after the fact. My mom saw afterwards that I was much happier and calmer and kinder as a monk, so now she is quite approving. But in the beginning, my parents were completely opposed. Yeah. Later. Yeah. So I think we'll go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 sadhus. Okay. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.